energy, climate, pollution issues in China. Now, I have a background as a water person. And so then, of course, you start seeing when I come on board, a lot of meetings on water. What a surprise. But I was telling Lester right before the meeting, Lester Brown here, that actually when I was in PhD land at Indiana University, so this was, I finished in 1997. So around 1995, when I was 94, I was going to China. But even up into that, I felt very lonely, right? Because no other PhD, no master's student at all of Indiana University was looking at China environment. And it was almost cute. It's like, oh, really? That's nice. And then, you know, there were people that did China studies that were looking at economic issues. And I kept thinking, where's my author? Unless I read your book, Who Will Feed China? And it made me realize, it kind of buoyed my spirits. And I know it sounds schmaltzy, but, you know, PhD land is a lonely time. And that, you know, read a book that said, yes, what happens in China is, you know, China, you didn't say this, but my line is, China is not Las Vegas. What happens there doesn't stay there, right? It's, you know, China is very important and we need to understand it. And so I did my dissertation that didn't make a good book like yours, but it got me into the field. And so here at the Wilson Center, while I focus on water, we've done a lot on food safety as well. 2006, 7, and 8, we did a series of meetings. Some of the people in the room were coming to those back then, where we tried to do a deep dive into what's going on with food. Particularly, we focused on the safety issue. And I know then, you know, the grant ran out, you know, things happened. But then we started feeling like we got to get back to the food issue. A couple weeks ago, we had a meeting on soil pollution that actually, I think because of the metro, where more people will be coming in, but we had a full room here with people, maybe a little bit nerdy, but really excited to talk about sludge and soil contamination, right? So I realized that, you know, the food issue is really important, not just to China, but to the world. So we're going to start off today. We have, as you know, Lester Brown, who you have a little shortened bio, but I know that started off as a farmer, studied ag science, hung out in India a while, learning about food production and population issues there, ag economist for USDA. And then you founded World Watch, which is also a good source of information that I read in grad school. And a number of years ago, you founded the Earth Policy Institute, where you just continue just producing just amazing books, and you're a thinker. And today, Lester is going to talk to us. I mean, it's 20th anniversary of the Who Will Feed China book. And you're still asking that question, I'm guessing. He's going to talk to us about food security issues. Amy Celico from the Albright Stonebridge Group, who I've talked on the phone numerous times. I get to meet her live here at the Wilson Center. She leads the firm's China and East Asia practice. She brings 20 years of experience focusing on issues in the region to her clients, helps them developing their business strategies. You make them succeed, I'm guessing. We hope. We try to. And now you're like, well, why is she talking, right? Well, you know, it's a valid question. But so before that, as Senior Director for China Affairs at the Office of U.S. Trade Representative, negotiating trading positions, I'm going to venture that you guys probably dealt with food issues sometimes.
We did.
You did with food issues. And so, you know, so working with the S&ED, U.S. Joint Commission on Commerce and Trade, she's got, these two people up front are packed full of lots of experience and insights. And Amy's going to try to, and, you know, when I look at the food issue, I see safety as a security issue as well. But in some ways, kind of splitting it, you're going to maybe venture a little bit into more on the food safety side of the question with China. And I'm going to officially be quiet. And now, it's a good thing you're sitting down, because this morning's presentations will not have PowerPoints. You would swoon. Okay, so we're going a little bit good old school here. We're actually going to have conversations. Are you guys ready? So your job as the attentive audience will be to think of difficult questions, because these two speakers will be able to handle it. So I think the red line delay stuff is we've gotten the people in the room that we need. So Lester, I'm officially stuck. See, I chat on longer when there's a metro delay, so we get a few more people in the room. And it's you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. Thanks for organizing this session, and thanks for including me in it. I will just make some brief comments to serve as a backdrop for the discussion. I was a little surprised that anyone noticed that this was the 20th anniversary of Who Will Feed China. I didn't think anyone was paying that much attention. The timing of Who Will Feed China was interesting, It was 20 years ago, and I tried to reconstruct some of the events associated with that release. At the World Watch Institute, which was where I was at the time, we did a press conference this was late in August, on a Thursday. It got a little attention, but it wasn't overwhelming at all. But the article, it was based on the article that was in World Watch magazine entitled, "Who Will Feed China?" Now, the Post had asked if they could reprint that article in the Outlook section on Sunday, and I gave them permission, but as editors are wont to do, they changed the title to "How China Will Starve the World."
Oh.
On Monday morning, the Ministry of Agriculture in Beijing held a press conference responding to this study. And they said something like, we're sure Mr. Brown is well-intentioned, but he doesn't understand Chinese agriculture. We have always fed ourselves, and we always will. That became the mantra. We have always fed ourselves, we always will. So I knew about the Great Famine, of course, in 1959-61, but what I didn't fully appreciate was the sort of social scars left in Chinese society as a result of that. And no political leader in China could admit that China might become dependent on the outside world for part of its food supply, because that would just play to the vulnerabilities that people in China felt as a result of having experienced the Great Famine. I also realized that the people who were in office in Beijing in 1994 were all survivors themselves of the famine. That's a famine where, according to official numbers, 37 million people starved to death. That's more than the population of Canada. It's huge. The inspiration for doing Who Will Feed China came from having studied agriculture in Japan and looked at what had happened in Japan over time. I studied, when I say I studied Japan, when I was in the Department of Agriculture, Japan was one of my responsibilities in the Foreign Agricultural Service. And what I began to see was a pattern that you could see in Japan, you could see it in Taiwan, in South Korea, where you have densely populated countries, and you have industrialization. And when that happens, 2 or 3 trends are set in motion. One, industrialization pulls labor out of the countryside, and that typically reduces the amount of multiple cropping that can be done. Multiple cropping requires it's a labor-intense thing. You have to get one crop harvested and another one in the ground quickly. They didn't have the labor to do that, so the rice harvest began to shrink. And so the combination of the loss of rural labor, the loss of cropland to industrialization, and industrialization means building factories and warehouses and roads and so forth, they combined to raise Japan's grain imports until eventually today Japan imports 70% of all the grain it consumes. And what happened in Japan was that from the harvest peak, which was probably in Japan's case back around 1960 until 1994, the harvest had shrunk by 32%. And there were similar percentage declines for Taiwan and South Korea for the same reasons, namely loss of cropland, loss of rural labor, less multiple cropping, et cetera. So what I did was simply to take the experience of these 3 countries and apply that model to China and ask the question, what happens in China, which is also a densely populated country, as it industrialized? And the Chinese were quick to respond to my analysis when it came out in 1994, and they responded by greatly increasing the investment and attention to agriculture. They raised support prices for farmers by some 40%. They doubled the investment in agricultural research. I mean, across the board, they really wanted to, and they realized that as with many developing countries, they sort of got caught up with the industrialization. We're beginning to neglect agriculture. And this article sort of served as a wake-up call and got them to rethinking things. Now, in their effort to remain self-sufficient in grain, which they succeeded at, and still are today, I mean, they import maybe 20 million tons last year, which is 4% of their harvest. It's negligible. But what they did was to sacrifice the soybean. The soybean was domesticated in China, in eastern China, some 3,000 years ago. But I just want to give you 4 numbers. In 1994, China produced 14 million tons of soybeans. It consumed 14 million tons of soybeans. In 2014, it produced 14 million tons of soybeans. It consumed 85 million tons of soybeans. So there was a huge jump in imports because the Chinese themselves could not expand soybean production on anywhere near the scale needed. Now, the soybean is sort of an invisible commodity. We don't really see it in our refrigerators, for example. Soybeans' role is primarily to provide soybean meal to mix with grain. You crush the soybean, you get about 80% meal, 20% oil. The oil is a good table oil and is used for that purpose, but the meal, which was sort of a byproduct originally, has now become by far the most valuable part of that process. And around the world, whether you have steers in the feedlot or you're growing pigs or chickens, the rule of thumb is 4 parts grain, 1 part soybean meal. So feeding everywhere. I mean, you can go to Brazil, you can go to Europe, you can go to China, this country, wherever. That's the rule, 4 parts grain, 1 part soybean meal. Now, one of the difficulties with soybeans is we have not been very successful at raising soybean yields. If you go back to, say, 1950, world grain yield per acre at least tripled, maybe more than that. But soybeans only went up 60% or so. It's very difficult to get soybean yields to rise rapidly. And the principal reason for that is that soybeans are legumes and they fix their own nitrogen. Now with corn, putting on nitrogen really gives you a huge kick. But with soybeans, it didn't make that much difference. So we didn't have any way of easily raising soybean yields. So getting more soybeans, for the most part, meant planting more soybeans. And what that's translating into right now, incidentally, is as China's 1.36 billion people move up the food chain, requiring more and more soybeans, the only place in the world now that can expand soybean production substantially is Brazil, and by clearing the Amazon. So it's moving up the food chain in China that's generating the additional pressures that are leading to the clearing of the Amazon for soybean production. If you look in your refrigerator, almost everything you see has soybeans in it. Milk, cheese, eggs, hamburger. I mean, go down the list. There's soybeans embedded in all of these foodstuffs. Now, the growth in demand for grain comes either as a result of population growth or rising affluence. World population growth right now is growing at 1.2% a year, so we're adding roughly 80 million people a year. And we've been doing that now for the last few decades. But when you move up the food chain, you create an enormous new opportunity for generating demand for grain. To sort of give a sense of what this looks like, if you live in India, you consume about 400 pounds of grain per person per year, roughly a pound a day. It takes that much to sort of keep body and soul together. And with only a pound a day, you can't afford to convert much of it into animal protein. But in this country, we consume 1,200, 1,400 pounds of grain per year, excluding ethanol, because we've moved up the food chain. And the conversion for grain to meat is steers in the feedlot. It takes about 7 pounds of grain to add an additional pound of meat. For pigs, it's about 3 pounds of grain per pound of meat. For poultry, it's less than 2. And for carp or catfish, it's almost a 1-to-1 ratio. So by far the most efficient way of converting grain into animal protein is to raise fish, which is what China has done. China is raising now and consuming, I think it's 40 or so million tons of carp and catfish per year. In looking at the soybean situation, China could not produce the additional soybeans that it needed, so it turned to, excuse me, basically the Western Hemisphere. And the big 3 soybean producers in the world today are the United States, Brazil, and Argentina. The U.S. produces about 100 million tons of soybeans, Brazil 90, Argentina about 55 million tons. But these 3 countries are today the soybean suppliers to the world. And, excuse me, and of course to China. 60% of all the soybeans that go into the world market go to China. So China's become a huge sponge, sort of soaking up soybeans from wherever they can get them. When you have a country like China with 1.36 billion people moving up the food chain, you really begin to generate a lot of demand for grain and for soybean meal. And that's what's happening in China today. I mean, not every person in China is moving up the food chain, but most, the great majority of the 1.36 billion are. And that is creating demand both for grain and for soybeans. One of the consequences of this enormous growth in the demand for soybeans in China is that it has led to a restructuring of agriculture in the Western Hemisphere. In the Western Hemisphere today, that's Canada south through Argentina, there's now more land in soybeans than either wheat or corn. So soybeans are the crop now in the Western Hemisphere. In addition to buying huge quantities of land from abroad, of grain and particularly soybeans from abroad, China has been very much involved in what I call the new geopolitics of food, which is land acquisitions outside one's border on which to produce food to bring back home. China's acquired large tracts of land in Brazil, in the Ukraine, a number of other countries, some in Southeast Asia, with the plan to satisfy the enormous projected growth that we see for grain and soybeans in China on this land. Now, let me just mention a couple of broad factors that are going to affect the food prospect in which these trends will be unfolding. One is climate change. The agricultural system we have in the world today has evolved over an 11,000-year period of rather remarkable climate stability. When I was farming back in the 50s, we would have a heat wave or a drought or something, but we didn't really worry about it too much because we knew that the next year things would probably go back to the norm. What's new now is that there is no norm to go back to. We don't know where we'll be next year, or the year after, or 10 years from now. A recent, recent study from Stanford points out that a 1 degree for this country, and this is based on crop yield data for the last few decades in this country, and I think 600 counties where the Stanford team gathered the data. And what they concluded was that in this country, at least, for each 1 degree Celsius rise in temperature during the growing season, we get a 17% decline in the harvest. And then you begin thinking, well, some of the projections for this century are that temperature could rise 6 degrees Celsius. I mean, that's sort of the upper limit. But even 1 degree Celsius could cost us 17% of the grain harvest. Now, that suggests, among other things, we need to get involved in trying to breed more drought-resistant crops, crops that can do reasonably well without so much rain. One of the things I've noticed in China, and you see different manifestations of this, is that China is slowly drying out. There are thousands of lakes that have literally disappeared because water tables are dropping, and aquifers are being depleted as a result of overpumping. China relies heavily on irrigation, and the greater part of that irrigation comes from the Yangtze and the Yellow Rivers. But it also, particularly on the North China Plain, which is sort of the corn belt or the wheat belt of China, on the North China Plain, they're tapping underground water supplies and doing it on a large scale. The result is that water tables are falling, and those aquifers, that aquifer is being depleted. Now, the deep aquifer under the North China Plain happens to be a fossil aquifer. It's like the Ogallala aquifer in the western plains of the U.S. and the North Texas, western Kansas area. A fossil aquifer is water that was laid down eons ago, but where there's no recharge from precipitation. So it's like an oil field. Once you pumped it out, that's it. It doesn't regenerate. So the drying up of China is, I think, a major concern, and it may influence the energy economy as well as agriculture. It takes a lot of water, for example, if coal is your principal fuel source. And there's a question now as to which way China will be going in the future. I think they're going to move away from coal pretty fast, actually, for a number of reasons, but one of them is because of the water it takes. We don't think of water being use being associated with coal, but it is. So I think the drying up of China, the lakes going dry, aquifers being depleted is a major issue, and it is disturbing not just because of China, but because this is happening in so many places in the world. Overpumping is widespread now. In India, for example, water tables are falling in every state. If you're a farmer in India, you do not need a license to drill an irrigation well. As a result, they have 26 million irrigation wells in India now. And water tables are falling everywhere, literally in every state. Water tables are going down. Now, you can overpump in the short run, but not in the long run. The World Bank did some calculations, this is probably 5 years ago now, and they calculated that 175 million people in India were being fed with grain produced by overpumping. Mm-hmm. Now, if you were to do that calculation today, it would probably be 250 million or something like that. I did a similar calculation for China, and concluded that 120 million Chinese today are being fed with grain produced from overpumping. So it's the overpumping issue is a big one, and what we've done is create these sort of water-based food bubbles that will not be sustained over the long term. At some point, when the aquifers are depleted, production will start to go down, as it has in North Texas and western Kansas, where we've largely depleted the Ogallala aquifer, which is also a fossil aquifer. Oh, yours.
It's all mine. Wow. Quick applause or sustain. I have to interject, Lester, that we've actually here I didn't go into the details at the beginning, but for the last 4 years, we've been looking at the coal-water confrontations in China. And we've actually, through our multimedia reporting and convenings, and the Chinese government has actually started regulating water in the coal sector, because we estimate that upwards to 20% of the water used in China goes to the whole production line of coal. And but the funny thing is, when we were doing our research, we were going in looking at water energy, and then we had to put food in, because you talk to the Chinese Ministry of Water officials, and they say, oh, 问题不大, it's not a big problem. Because in north central China, where there's all the ag, we said, well, you've got the coal and the water, what are you going to do? Not a problem. We're going to move the grain belt. So they've been doing a lot more investment into irrigation, into irrigated land up in Heilongjiang, Liaoning, up in the northeast. So they're going to engineer their way out of it. We'll talk more about that in Q&A, but it's like, thanks for the insight. I was pleased you mentioned coal. Okay, we got a little dodgy food security linked with water issue here. What's going on food safety, Amy? To get the conversation going, because again, we're just talking today.
I'm just going to add to the dilemmas that China faces by focusing a little bit on food safety. Really interesting to hear that perspective, Lester. 20 years ago, I was living in Nanjing, and so I remember very well when your book came out and how the Chinese government responded to it. And I think you're absolutely right. It was sort of a kick in the pants to remind them that in 1978, Deng Xiaoping had made agriculture one of his 4 modernizations. And then, as you said, maybe went a little gangbusters on 2 of the other 4, probably industry development as well as military and a little bit science and technology, but ag really wasn't modernizing, and so how was China going to continue to cope with its own growth? For the last 6 years, not only has China been facing this issue of can it maintain this illusion of food security, self-sufficiency, and since it can't, how will it deal with that? But it's also dealing with this incredible problem on the ground in China that people don't trust the food that they're consuming. In 2013, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences released a study that said that food safety was the #1 concern of Chinese citizens. Now, in the past, that had been, inequality issues, of course, governance issues, corruption. But in 2013, as a new government was taking over in China, this is what they inherited. And at Albright Stonebridge Group, what my firm does is we work with clients who are working in China and try to help them be more effective. And the way we see that, whether our client is a nonprofit, is a Fortune 500 company, is an industry association, is for it to align its goals with some of the Chinese government's priorities. And so for our clients who are making or distributing food and ag products, we at Albright Stonebridge Group have been looking very closely at this new government's focus on food safety and food security. And, allow me to geek out a little bit here, but we...
You're in DC, that's fine. It's
exactly. When a year ago, I noted that this morning the Chinese finally announced their party plenum will take place October 20th next month, and so that's interesting news for all of us in advance of APEC. The party plenum will take place. Well, a year ago in November, we were very interested to see what the new Xi Jinping, Li Keqiang leadership was going to actually lay out as its policy priorities. The year before, they had come into power. In 2013, in November, it was their time to really lay out what are we going to prioritize. And in fact, of course, they prioritized agricultural modernization, coming back to the 4 modernizations and recognizing in a vastly different world than one that, Lester, you just talked about in great depth, China has significant food security problems. In addition to that, they also have their own citizens concerned about the quality and the safety of the food that they're feeding to their children. And as a social stability issue, we have watched this government focus like a laser beam on trying to address these issues. So at the Party Congress last November, of course, they talked about agricultural modernization in terms of the overall construct of urban-rural development and trying to minimize that vast divide that we now see is larger than, the income disparity that we have in the United States, as well as allowing private forces to play a larger role in the Chinese economy. And again, I'm looking at this question from the perspective of my clients. And so we see, again, the opportunity as the Chinese government is saying, we need to allow the private economy to play a larger role in how China develops. That means international foreign investors, as well as those who are contributing to China's development domestically in achieving these goals. Right after the Party Congress in November, in December, there were two very important work conferences that happened. One included the Politburo Standing Committee members, and the other was the Economic Work Conference. At both of those conferences, again, the focus was on how do we actually implement agricultural modernization to deal with the food security issues that we face, as well as the food safety issues that could become a short-term social stability problem for our government. And by March of this year, we saw at the National People's Congress the government trying to start to unfold new policies, policies that could offer opportunities for foreign investors in the market, as well as really putting the onus on China to start to step up the modernization of its domestic agriculture sector. One sector that we see China trying very hard to deal with because of the resource constraints that it faces is how do they raise more pigs in China? Because, when 70% of the protein consumed in China is pork, they recognize that they need to change from this small farmer model to larger integrated farms that will allow China to produce more meat and hopefully allow China to produce more meat in a more sustainable way, dealing with the other issues that we're talking about here. And so Li Keqiang offered up some policy priorities that our clients have begun to start to take advantage of. And this is what I want to talk about for a few minutes. The effectiveness of trying to work with China to change how it operates in pursuit of its own goals. I mean, again, this concept of goal alignment is so important to be a positive force in the China market for Chinese or foreign investors. And not only U.S. foreign industry, but the Europeans, Latin Americans have also looked at how they can play a role in offering two different things: advice on policy changes that the Chinese government is making to enhance food security standards, as well as real technical assistance to show the Chinese how they can be more efficient and allow their agriculture sector to modernize. And so the French government with Carrefour working with the China Food and Drug Association, the U.S. government pulling together a very large coalition of companies on the sidelines of the upcoming APEC Leaders Summit for an agriculture and food symposium that's focused very much on the issues of how does domestic and foreign investment help the agriculture sector grow? How does technology and innovation help the agriculture sector grow? And how can we deal with the very significant challenge of food security? Foreign as well as domestic industry needs to work together to try to help China meet some of these significant challenges that they face. And I think that as we're looking at future Chinese focuses, our chairman from Albright Stonebridge Group, Carlos Gutierrez, one of three of our chairs, was just in Beijing in September. He was invited by the AQSIQ minister to speak at a China product quality conference. September was Product Quality Month in China, and Carlos was invited to speak at a conference that Li Keqiang also spoke at. And Li Keqiang was talking about the need to build quality products in China and not focus on the quantity of products. This is very much in line with the entire economic restructuring that the government is going through, not focusing on a lot of growth, but focusing on quality growth. Well, in order to overcome the problem that they have in the food and product sector of people being worried about the quality of the products, the government has shown from the highest levels on down that they care, that they are putting more inspectors in place from AQSIQ to CFDA around the country to prosecuting more food and product safety crimes, to allowing whistleblowers to speak up. And Carlos, in speaking to this audience of mainly Chinese government bureaucrats from around the country, said, industry has a role in this as well. It's not just government regulation that's going to ensure higher quality and better safety standard for your products. It's also the role of industry throughout the process. And again, I'll just close by saying that's where I see, and I see it from many of the people in this room, in fact, your contribution to China, helping them with the technical expertise and the policy advice as they're enhancing their food safety law and many, many other regulations. There's a role for the nonprofit sector as well as business to advise China, again, saying this is their policy priority, but it impacts all of us too. Thank you.
All right. All right. Well, one thing I'm struck with, I'll open up in just a second, is that as you were talking, Amy, because this is my pub that we did back in 2006, Sowing the Seeds, about opportunities for U.S. China cooperation on food safety. It was in Chinese as well. And
Oh, excuse me.
Oh, you have a copy too?
Is that it?
oh my gosh, I'm like Vanna White here. No, but I had a, but it sounds, I mean, it's encouraging some of the trends that you're saying that what they're talking about, but I'm getting a little deja vu-y because, I mean, there were some big food crises, food safety problems back in 2004, 2005, you know.
It's gotten worse though,
And it's
right?
gotten worse, but I kept, you know, I was hoping you were going to bring us, well, I guess you kind of brought some good news, but they're still working on a food safety law, but by opening up to the international business community, that's.
And not just the business community. Again, I think foreign governments, foreign nonprofits, as well as international industry has a role here to play in advising the Chinese. And what I'm seeing, you know, as a positive, just the enormity of this problem for the Chinese. They recognize they need as much help as they can get in order to basically improve their standards. And a lot of it is enforcement. As you know from this study, the laws were on the books. They just weren't being enforced. And, you know, when people weren't being punished for crimes, when it was just a cost of doing business, these minuscule fines that businesses would face, that wasn't a deterrent. And I think that this government is trying very hard to deal with that. But they're also very hungry for the kind of expertise that foreign experts, whether in the private or public or nonprofit sector, can offer.
You know, just a couple weeks ago, when we had our soil pollution meeting, we had a woman from the World Bank, from the Jeff, and I think she'd been feeling a little lonely too. She was really excited to be networked in, you know, with the people we had in the room, because they're doing a project to do not only soil remediation pilot projects in a couple provinces, but also trying to work with the governance side about, well, gee, you know, industries, not just they enforce the law, but working with industries to train them about environmental risk. I mean, one of the challenges with, I mean, you heard about the Hunan rice case? In Hunan province, there was in Guangdong, someone started testing the rice and discovering that a lot of it had cadmium in it.
Yeah.
And it ends up that Hunan province, where I taught for a while, that Hunan is both a rice basket and has a lot of non-ferrous metals companies. And it's not like a Reese's peanut butter cup, you know. This
Right,
doesn't go
two
together
great
nicely
things.
when you're not enforcing water pollution control from these ever-growing compounds. And so, but last question, when you were in these conversations, do they talk about the water pollution control laws as well? I mean, because it's a lot of the way in, a lot of this pollution's getting into the crops.
Well, I know that NDRC, just in looking at recent things, the American Chamber of Commerce in China was working with NDRC this year and saying, what are your priorities? And they too were talking about water and saying this is one area where we really have to make a change. And I was reading how the Chinese on the supply side, they're going to raise the cost for urban dwellers of water as urban consumers, industrial as well as private. Again, because they want agriculture to have access to water, but they want that water to be clean.
It has to be clean. I mean, China has to be the only country in the world that has a common term called water pollution-induced scarcity. Lester, one question to you, and then I let these people at you. This year, China had a bumper corn harvest, which is, I guess, rattling the U.S. corn farmers who say, like, they're not going to buy my corn. I mean, is this just is this a blip? Have they gotten better? I mean, I was curious about what you're seeing in terms of, I mean, China is importing more, but are you seeing them, are they also going to try to ramp up their own ag production still?
They're continuing to make a major effort and a lot of investment in agriculture. One of the things you have to keep in mind is that the more you overpump, the faster the harvest grows in the short run. And there's enough overpumping in China now that one of these days they're going to face the consequences. I mean, we have in the Middle East the 4 Arab countries, Iraq, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen, where all 4 reached peak water some years back and where production started to decline and where they're almost in not a free fall, but going down a very steep hill now in production and importing. Each year they have to import more and more of their grain. And the Saudis now project that by 2016, I mean, after being self-sufficient in grain for 20 years, that by 2016 they will be out of the grain production business entirely because they will not have any water left for agriculture. What little they have left, they're saving for their cities. The other thing is that the pollution issue in health is an interesting one. My colleague Janet Larson has looked at cancer rates in China. Janet, where are you?
Janet.
And things like cancer villages where there's such concentrations of toxics that of carcinogenic chemicals that they're I mean, it's a very measurable effect in terms of how it's affecting the health of people in particular areas.
Okay.
That's
All
it.
right. All right. Janet, did you want to leap in? Do you have anything to add to what Lester just said before I do Q&A? There's a microphone coming. We're on a webcast, so unless you can yell really loud.
Thanks. Yeah, I would concur that it's both a quality and a quantity issue. I wanted to let everybody know that if they were missing PowerPoint and slides and visuals, we do have all the numbers that Lester Brown gave on our website, earthpolicy.org, along with a PowerPoint presentation that does go into some of the detail and articles on this topic, the cancer villages topic, and peak water as well, talking about the falling water tables around the world. So please check it out.
Yeah. That's also the reason I gave you the microphone, so you let them know that. Peak water, is China, is China, have they already hit the peak and going down?
No one knows for sure because we don't have national water use data for China, and we don't have it certainly for the world. But it is, I think it's quite possible that water has peaked in China, as it has in the United States, and as it appears to have for the world. So we're on the downside of the water thing now. So water efficiency is going to be a big issue as we move into the future. And as Amy was mentioning, or you were mentioning with coal in China, the use of water is getting a lot more attention now than at any time in the past.
Yeah. I mean, and on the good news, just last week, up at the climate talks that the Chinese government said that they're soon they're going to get to that peak coal, right? So it's a Himalayan-sized peak, but it's a peak. So we have to be happy about that. All right.
And while I still have the mic, I'll just
Oh,
say,
there she is. Yeah.
yeah, we have another one on peak meat. China has not reached peak meat yet, but the U.S. has. Meat consumption in the United States has actually been falling since 2007, and it looks to be a real trend. So we just need to figure out how to spread that one around.
Yeah, it's actually when you say, because we didn't have multimedia things, we actually, the only thing that in my 15 years here that we've had go viral was our pork consumption infographic. It was very pink. It had little pigs on it. It didn't move, but it gave some very, jaw-dropping stats about how much pork consumption has gone up. And this is just, it's not criticism of the people in China, right? They're eating more pork. They're just a lot more people, but also about the stats about just the pork sector alone produces 3 times the solid waste as industry in China, and a lot of that's not being treated. So yeah, peak meat. I like that term.
Meat.
This is I'm seeing an infographic
We're
forming
not
in my
even
head.
close
We're not even close in China.
in China.
Okay, some other questions, and when you, if you can just say your name and have a quick question. But Lester, did you have something to add before I went off on my peak meat tirade?
I was just going to say, in comparing the U.S. and China, China consumes now twice as much meat as the United States, but per capita consumption
Right.
in China is only half that of the United States. So it begins to give a feel for how much meat marketing potential is coming down the road.
Particularly as China wants to, as more affluent people, they're going to start eating meat like Americans do.
Unfortunately, they want
Scary,
to
yeah.
live like Americans.
But that kind of bespeaks the question of with the factory farms that are expanding. We have an article coming up in our next pub called "Urbanizing China's Pigs," but that this is where the U.S. We have expertise in
Exactly.
the CAFOs, factory farms that
That right on the mic,
could maybe bring.
That must be.
There's a market for that in
All those
China? Bring those
hands.
efficiencies?
It's interesting. For one client of ours,
Test,
a
test,
few
test.
years
1, 2, 3.
ago,
And these
we
are both
were
working fine,
meeting
too,
with
so.
Kafko, which of course is a
Okay,
Chinese
nice.
importer
1, 2, 3,
and
4,
becoming more of
5.
an investor in foreign companies. But Kafka was sharing with us the Ministry of Commerce's plans to really consolidate the pork industry to these large farms rather than allowing individual farmers. And again, the purpose was twofold. It was one, because they need to have more pigs, more pork, but the other was disease control. China has been decimated by the Chinese pig population has been decimated by disease, and in many ways it's because they haven't had adequate ways to really protect the pig population. And so that's exactly where American technology and know-how can help them. Those initial plans that we were shown back in 2008 scared the bejesus out of my client, because while it was going to ramp up production, it wasn't going to deal with the disease prevention problem. And so again, the expertise of American industry explaining to the Chinese how that needed to be tweaked is critical for them to be successful.
And also, I think too that there's an opportunity, because I do lots of meetings here. We had another meeting where we were talking about biogas a couple of years ago, and industrial biogas. And I had a Chinese researcher saying, she had a big picture of a Chinese chicken farm, and she's like, the potential of producing biogas for energy is huge, but for many, evidently chicken poop is not sexy to the electricity sector. But it's just like, it's an opportunity, but it goes back to what you were saying: water efficiency, energy efficiency, using your waste efficiency, right? It's that there's these opportunities, and so I think it's exciting to try to
Our
make.
client was working with the Qingyuan, a big egg producer, precisely on that, on how do you use your biogas. Because again, the U.S. industry has that expertise that it can share with the Chinese to help them deal with these issues.
And so in the U.S., just so I know about the U.S., our CAFOs produce biogas that might maybe supply energy for their own production or?
And I
sell
don't
on the
know
grid?
about the production, and again, I will turn over to any industry expert here, but we have the technology and the
technology.
know-how so that we can help with that process.
Okay, some other questions. Oh, they're shooting up here. How about, oh, the woman in the back, because she was so patient, she had her hand up. Maybe stand up so we can see you too, so thanks.
Kristen Burke with the State Department. I have two questions. One is about the South-North Diversion Project for water. If you could say something about, I mean, because we talked about dropping water tables and moving the, the crop belt north and whatnot. Could you talk about the project in terms of agriculture and water use? And the second question is about the sort of enforcing food safety guidelines and whatnot. And there was a study, it might have been the CAST study that you referenced, that they did a sort of public survey about where are the food safety concerns for the public, and they were mostly concerned with the processing industry, like processed foods and what companies are doing on that end. There was very little attention paid to pollution in the food, just fruits and vegetables and grains as it comes off the farm. And I wanted to know if you thought that that problem has gone away, or if they're just kind of trying to downplay that because they don't know how to regulate and enforce those issues yet, and they don't want to give, farmers a harder time than they already have. So the two questions about the diversion project and then, food safety issues as they come off the farm. Thanks.
Okay, good question. Who's going to grab it?
I can tell you I can't grab the north-south
I think
question.
Lester now can get that one. Do you want to do north-south? South-north?
Yeah, as I'm sure there's a lot more water in southern China than in northern China. But a lot of the cropland is in northern China. And so, and a lot of the industrial development is taking place in northern China as well. So the question is how to balance that. And there have been at least 3 or maybe 4 ways of getting water from the south to the north. Building canals, which can be very costly in some situations. There is the original, is it the Grand Canal
Big Grand Canal.
that moved water? So they're working on, and I think one of these links was opened just recently. I think I read one of these south-north water links. So this water imbalance is a challenge for China, and the investments required to move water from the south to the north are very substantial.
And lots well, the south-north, the eastern canal, as you said, the Grand Canal, which was already there, that started flowing a couple years ago. The central one, I think, comes online any moment. October, yeah, I was like, see, any moment. It was waiting until the end of our fiscal year. No, just kidding, sorry. Well, when we did our Choke Point China research, we, looking at the water, energy, how energy development's impacting water, we also thought, well, let's look at the other way. And we actually interviewed the chief engineer of the South-North Water Transfer Project and said, okay, this far western line, way up, Sichuan, getting waters from the Himalayan rivers way up there. I said, you guys aren't really going to build that. And he said, we must build it. We have to get that water to Xinjiang because we've got coal to mine, right? And so it's like this, I look at it, I actually sometimes give PowerPoints, but it's like a big picture, like a map of China. It's like a big chess game with water serving energy. You're moving the ag and make way for industry. And the fact, too, that with the air pollution problem, one of the solutions is creating a synthesized natural gas, putting that further west in China. And last time I checked, that needs a lot of water. Lester's right that they're moving this water from the south to the north, but it's not like it's necessarily going to Farmer Wong. Because, ag is already consuming, what's the percentage of water use in ag in China? It's 65% of China's water? Yeah.
I'd say at least, yeah.
Yeah, so the ag sector is already using a lot of water, so it's hard to, I don't know, maybe, but the water, I think generally, like Beijing, big straw, they want the water. So a lot of this water is going to the industry and the urban areas, which we could say in theory is leaving some for ag. It's an excellent, it's hard to say. You're asking me to say, does anyone have the allocation plan for the South-North Water Transfer Project? Haven't found it, still looking. why don't they move the ag south?
Climate.
Lester, why don't they move the ag
Right.
south? Wouldn't that make sense?
It's already there.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So it's not as though there was a lot of land in the south waiting to be plowed. Everything is being used now. So the only additional land is in the more arid regions of the north, and that takes more water. So that's an issue that they won't be able to avoid.
But in the Northeast, where they're expanding the agriculture, this is kind of for both of you. I know that I've actually, when I've been on airplanes, and I know I'm very shy, but I strike up conversations, and and several times there's been it wasn't Caterpillar, but those kind of folks, and there's like this big guy saying, I'm off to China because we're selling equipment, and he was saying the U.S. technology is going to help China be better farming. Is this kind of your area? Do you hear these conversations too about the U.S. industry helping China in terms of we got the plains up in Northeast China?
Well, it's been interesting for us. I mean, it is not my area of expertise to advise my clients on what part of China where they should invest. But for example, there's as our clients have been looking at China's pork production expansion, the question is, should the pigs be closer to the feed or should they be closer to the people? What's the cost of transporting either the pork or the feed to get to them? And so these are the questions that these businesses are having with local governments around China who are encouraging foreign investment because obviously pork is needed all over the country. It doesn't have to be shipped across the country, but what do you want to ship? Do you want it to be in the Northeast where there's going to be a lot of feed and a lot of soybeans coming into the ports right there from Brazil and the United States? Or do you want it to be in the middle of China where there's a big population? And that's the question that our clients are certainly traveling around China, like you say, having these discussions with local governments. And what are the subsidies? Again, in the 2014 National People's Congress, part of agriculture modernization is the government saying, and we're going to pay. Not only are we going to pay to subsidize the development of agriculture, we're going to pay to stabilize prices, to ensure that both producers and consumers aren't going to be adversely harmed as we're trying to modernize the agriculture sector. But to your question about what kind of food safety issues are being publicized, I think obviously in the press we're seeing a lot more of the processing problems because they really are egregious, right? When you're adding melamine to milk powder. Or, fake product to meat. And so that's what's in the press more, the fact that pollution is seeping into the soil, which is leading to tainted products through growth. I think the government is less anxious to publicize because, frankly, it's a much scarier picture to be painting about China's food supply. For a lot of our international clients in China, they see the Chinese government almost trying to play gotcha at their products when there are inequality problems. It's not just Chinese products that can be substandard, but international products can be too. And I don't fault the Chinese. I think substandard products anywhere should be highlighted and the companies should be punished. The problem is that the Chinese government is still grappling with putting this system in place to actually enforce these laws and figure out what is the punishment for this behavior. And the Supreme People's Court has come out with wonderful statistics about 2.6 times more prosecutions this year than a year ago, but we're not really seeing is the deterrent effect really.
And I'm going to get Shopei, can you come here, these two gentlemen here? And while Mike's coming there, but are these prosecutions of big companies? Because sometimes we've seen, like with the water pollution control law, is they go after the tiny little farmer guys. Are these big cases?
Well, I think it's across the board. I mean, they're encouraging more whistleblowers to actually speak up and say that there are food safety problems at factories, in restaurants. So it's not just in production facilities. It's also in the distribution chain and then the end users.
Okay, good. All right, right here. Do you have the mic? You're in control.
Hello. I'm Qihang Zheng from Xinhua News Agency. I have two questions. The first question is that you mentioned that a lot of European and U.S. Companies want to show expertise to China, but recently we hear not only Chinese companies, several reputable foreign companies like Walmart and its suppliers also have food scandals in China. So I want to know why those reputable foreign brands also have food scandals in China. And the second question is that we know agriculture is a risky industry, and transfer technology know-how has cost. So I want to know what's your expectation for the market of the cooperation between foreign companies and Chinese companies on food security, and also how to bear this cost. Do you think between the financial sectors of the China and the foreign countries can help to finance or to bear part of the cost of the expertise transfer? Thank you.
Okay.
I really don't want to say why international companies are having problem in the China market, but I'm not surprised that, you know, international companies, Chinese companies, if they're not vigilant overseeing their production processes, they're going to be food safety problems. And I think that when international companies have found food safety issues in China, they, you know, quickly reporting the problems to try to deal with it in an effective way is something that highlights how real problems that happen every day should hopefully be dealt with, not in an opaque way that hides the problem from consumers as well as from government authorities. And so why is that happening in China? I think it's happening all over the world with foreign and domestic companies, food manufacturers, food and product manufacturers. On your other question, which I'm now forgetting. Oh, I'm sorry,
Bear
the
the cost,
financial,
the
yeah,
cost, yeah.
it's an excellent question, in fact. And I think, you know, we're already seeing the statistics are way up on the amount of foreign investment that China has made on food investments over the past year. I mean, obviously, a year ago, the landmark Shuanghui acquisition of Smithfield was quite newsworthy. But since then, there have been a number of other acquisitions. And I would note that I think the Chinese government is trying to be very encouraging to both its state-owned and its private companies, like Shuanghui is, that it can receive financing from Chinese financial institutions. But one of the things that the U.S. China Agriculture and Food Partnership is going to discuss this November in Beijing is about financing. How can we ensure that foreign as well as Chinese companies can afford to invest in the kind of technology that's going to allow agriculture to be more sustainable and allow it to expand in China? And so that discussion will be one of the topics of expertise exchange in Beijing in November.
Do you think they're going to talk about soybeans at all?
Soybeans might come up.
Soybeans might come up. Okay, 'cause I was, yes.
As we've been talking about food security in China, a couple of things have come up that I think are relevant. One is rice production in China is probably not going to increase much more. And the reason for that is the same reason it has not increased in the last 17 years in Japan. Japan started raising rice yields back around 1850, but by late 90s, they had reached the point where they had hit the glass ceiling.
Peak rice.
Peak rice. They couldn't go any further. So for 17 years now, they've been flat. It's not that Japanese farmers wouldn't like to increase rice production. They just can't. Once you remove the moisture constraints and the nutrient constraints, then you hit the limits of photosynthesis itself. And that one we don't have the know-how to alter. So that means that with China's rice yields, which are now 4% below those in Japan, unless Chinese farmers can take their yields above Japanese farmers through better farming or something, which I think is highly unlikely, then China is facing a plateauing of its rice production.
And just on the question of soybeans, I mean, there must be people working on this, but soybeans is so important for meat production, but is there, and you said that you can't really, it's difficult to expand it, like within China. Are there alternatives to soy in the meat, for feeding animals?
Not really.
Not really? Okay.
That's the problem. That's the best source of high-quality protein you can get, to get that one part high-quality protein to go with the 4 parts of grain. So it's one of those natural constraints that we're dealing with and don't have any way of overcoming.
Okay, good answer. So,
Hi,
and we'll
Paige.
keep the same question. Yeah.
Yeah, Page Yu from Voice of America. I have a question about the food safety. We know that food safety is a very serious problem in China. President Xi Jinping even said that if we cannot solve the problem of food safety for years, then people will have a good reason to doubt the quality of our party ruling the country. Some people say that food safety in China is a problem of law or regulations enforcement. But some people say perhaps it's not the law enforcement, because with the food for the leadership, the law and regulations are very strictly followed and enforced. The only problem is the laws and regulations are not applied to the food that for the public consumption. So do you have any insight about this problem, or Chinese leadership has any plan for this problem? Thank you.
Yeah, I think the Chinese government, the quote that you made is exactly, I think, what the Chinese government is thinking about when they're getting together next month at the Party Congress. When I think about the issues that the Chinese leadership is grappling with every morning, the U.S. China.
I wouldn't get out of bed.
Right, well, but the U.S.-China relationship is just so far down the list of its top concerns when it's thinking about the legitimacy of the Communist Party's rule of China. Food safety, that's a high issue. And then if you can't supply people with food, that's a social stability issue and an issue of the utmost importance to the Communist Party. And I do think in the past few years, even though, Jennifer wrote this study years ago on the need for more cooperation on food safety, the problem has only gotten worse. But it has reached the highest echelons, I think, of the Chinese leadership that they have to do something about it. And so we have seen over the past year stricter rules coming out to try to enhance enforcement. Because I agree with you, there have been a lot of laws on the books, but when it comes to enforcement and deterring bad behavior, that I think is where AQSIQ and CFDA and all of the others who are involved with regulating the food industry have fallen short. And the government is trying to deal with that, but because they see it as an issue, that's linked to their survival. So I do think we'll see more. I think we'll see a continued focus on this issue until it's dealt with effectively.
I mean, back in 2006 when we did this, one of the things that we talked about was how back then there was a 2-tiered system of food safety, right? While there was the melamine scandal here, in general, the exports were pretty good, because when we talked to industry folks, they were checking what was going through. There was the fish issue, but in terms, so that seems to still be the case, but you said it's only getting worse. But in terms of U.S. cooperation, it's really encouraging to me to see the U.S. and Chinese governments talking, but I still don't see as much U.S., and European maybe as well, but U.S. NGOs and research institutes really engaging with their Chinese partners. A lot of it comes from probably funding, because a lot of the foundations that support a lot of the NGOs and the network that, that you see on energy and environment, they're focused on the energy issue.
Yes.
And you just don't see, there was years ago, there's the Pesticide Action Network in Yunnan, and I keep looking, so if you have to, people have to let me know if there are groups that are going to China wanting to work on ag, food safety issues, let me know, because I think it's a network waiting to be built. Okay, this man has the mic, and then we'll come over here. Two people over here. Yeah, these two. Okay, start here. I'm going to gather two people's. Okay.
Donald Barnes from South China University of Technology in Guangzhou. This is for Lester Brown. You talk about the issue of the soybeans and the limitation that we have in terms of increasing the productivity. I keep listening for good news, and I'm straining very hard to hear. Perhaps Dr. Brown could mention something about what I understand is potentially good news for the soybean growth is the use of agromicrobes that would increase the effectiveness of the microbes and the root systems of legumes such as soybeans as a way to increase the productivity of those crops.
Okay, hold on to that a second. Pass the mic there. He's right there, so we're going to go two and then come to you there. We're getting there. We're getting there.
Thank you,
Just
Dave.
real quick, short
Dave
question.
Rabinowitz, one question for each speaker. First, Israel right now is the leader in water-efficient agriculture, and I'm wondering if China is working with Israel to improve its water efficiency. And the second question is, there have been some well-publicized executions of food adulterers in China. I'm wondering if that has any real deterrent effect.
Okay, that's quick, and then one more. Okay, sure. Yeah, we'll get to you. Okay.
Hi, Stephanie Tansey from ECCN, and we do sustainability education in China and the U.S. And so my first question, actually, for Lester is about the water and the rest of Asia, Southeast Asia and South Asia, and we haven't talked about the lack of water availability to all those nations, and someday they're all going to come north. And so that's one question. The other one is that actually China is doing a lot in sustainability education. They just come out with widespread use of textbooks that are definitely ESD focused and very excellent textbooks. And ESD, China is connected deeply with UNESCO. And so they're doing a lot of things to try to educate the students of the next generations to change the way they think about things so that they actually have a voice or at least a shift in their mind and their focus of how China is going to be in the future. Everybody's actually quite hopeless because of the Cultural Revolution and all these other things happened, but there is definitely a movement in developing resilience to what they want to do in the future. And the Shangtai Wenming and the ecological civilization is a very serious thing now, and we haven't addressed that here, but I think we should.
Okay, so, but your question was about the
One
water.
about the water
Water.
and also the effect of developing the people's will
People's
to want
will.
to be in accord with sustainability goals and these things.
All right, so we'll hold on the question gathering. So I think first one, we need some good news. They're getting depressed out there, Lester.
One of the things that is happening with water, probably 80% of the world's water is used for irrigation, is that we are seeing shifts in irrigation from the less efficient technologies to the more efficient ones. We begin with surface irrigation, that is, as with rice, land covered with water. And one of the things that we can do, and this is particularly important in a country like Egypt, for example, is we can shift from rice to wheat. It takes about twice as much water, 2,000 tons to grow a ton of rice, only 1,000 tons to grow a ton of wheat. So shifting diets is one way of dealing with the water issue, at least in some parts of the world. In terms of water availability in Asia, a lot of the water, of course, comes from the Himalayas, and it's interesting that who controls the origins of the snow melting in the streams is becoming an issue among countries, but particularly between India and China.
Yep.
And
Vietnam, yeah.
And my guess is that, I mean, my sense is that the big issue is not a lack of land. We have a lot of land in the world that could be very productive if we had the water to go with it. The principal constraint is not land, it's water. And I think that's going to become much clearer in the next few years. As I mentioned earlier, it takes 1,000 tons of water to produce a ton of grain. Then it takes 6 tons of grain to produce 1 ton of beef, or 3 tons of grain. And so you begin putting these together, and you begin to see that meat is a very water-intensive item. So I think the water issues are in various ways going to show up in the market in terms of prices, and we're going to see a water restructuring of the world food economy, and we'll begin to shift as a result of market forces from more water-intensive things to less water-intensive things. And the biggest thing you can do to save water, obviously, is to move down the food chain. And for many of us, that's something that would not only ease the water situation, but would also be healthier for us. So there's some win-win situations involved in responding to some of these growing stresses in the world food economy.
Okay, and maybe then there was a couple, also curious, any good news from you? And
Well-
then, just in general, and then also whether or not the ag water efficient, he kind of addressed the efficient ag question, I think.
Yeah, I think on the good news side, again, this is me with my Albright Stonebridge Group hat on, but American industry has a lot of expertise and technology that the world needs, that China doesn't have. And so there is the room for enhanced cooperation that should be mutually beneficial. And I think that, talking about sustainability, the people growing up in Beijing and Shanghai and wherever you are in China, they're living every day with the realities of pollution, not just in what they eat, but in how they breathe. And so this concept of sustainability education, I think, has definitely caught on. And I think that there is a generation of people who are going to say, what do we need to change? A generation ago, telling somebody in southern China, well, why don't you eat steamed rolls instead of rice with your meal, or noodles, would have been heresy, right? Because of cultural norms. But realities change. And so people make decisions based on something other than, oh, well, that's what traditionally we eat.
So that can affect what the government does.
Right, absolutely. And then on, the deterrent effect of executions, I think the first SFDA commissioner executed, maybe it didn't have much of a deterrent effect, but the fact that President Xi Jinping has made anti-corruption a lasting first initiative of his leadership has a lot of people worried in China. It goes way, way, way beyond food safety. This anti-corruption drive is starting from the top, and what we continue to hear when we're in Beijing from government leaders is, and it's going to continue. Wang Qishan is responsible for this, and he has the mandate to continue it, to clean up the Communist Party. And so I think, unfortunately, it's leading to a lot of inaction as people are too afraid to do anything in the bureaucracy. But I do think that slowly but surely, better law enforcement writ large is going to be the best deterrent.
I was curious, Amy, when they revamped the environmental protection law, the general one, and also with the pollution action plan, they've come up with ways to really want to try to keep local government officials accountable, saying, for example, with air pollution, it's not just that you've installed all the wastewater treatment, equipment and the air pollution desulfurization stuff, but that you actually turn it on and you have results, and there's now clear standards on PM 2.5, and you must meet them. Now, is any kind of criteria coming out in terms of food safety for local officials in the same vein of being very clear in the law and an action plan. Do we have a food safety action plan?
Well, they are trying to develop more food safety regulations, more real, what they call national food safety standards that are coming out of the health ministry. So again, there are just so many agencies involved in food safety, but I learned about the environmental standards from my colleague sitting in the back of the room, Tucker Van Aken. And what I learned from Tucker, who did his Fulbright in Chongqing and was looking at energy policy, was it's great to have the rule on the books, but if the rule doesn't also say, and you must implement these standards, you must turn on these energy efficiency technologies that you have to invest in, then it's not going to be effective. And in the world of food safety, the exact same thing is true. There are laws on the books, but I do think what the government is trying to figure out now with these national food safety standards is how do they implement things that will actually be seen as a positive thing for producers and for consumers so that you'll see better enforcement.
Tough nut, okay. Oh, yeah, sorry.
There are a couple questions that were here I neglected to respond to. The one was on the limits of soybean yields, and have we done any research on the microbes on the roots of the soybeans that fix the nitrogen to see if we could increase that efficiency? There has been research on this, but my sense is that the current feeling is that we don't know how to make any meaningful changes here. I mean, anything that makes the soybean plant healthier will benefit the microbes, because the soybean's photosynthetic energy actually feeds the microbes on its roots, and then the microbes in exchange fix nitrogen for the soybean. But it's not a simple system, and I don't know of any serious efforts or certainly of any successful efforts to increase the efficiency of nitrogen fixation. The country that's really done some of the best research on this is Brazil. Brazil, you may or may not remember, but after the U.S. put an embargo on soybeans to Japan, this was during the Nixon years because domestic food prices were rising so much. And when we did that, it scared the Japanese to death. And so they immediately went to Brazil and to Argentina and said, look, guys, we want to buy soybeans. If you'll grow them, we'll buy them. And so that's why today Brazil and Argentina are major soybean producers and exporters and competitors of the United States. The question on water efficiency and the Israel example, I think almost everyone in the water, or certainly the irrigation business, has looked at what the Israelis have done. They've been very successful with drip irrigation, which is extraordinarily efficient in the use of water. Some orchards now have underground pipes that are drip systems that so you don't have to move them around. The drip irrigation technology, where it can be economically used, is extraordinarily efficient in water use. The difficulty is using it for large crops like corn and wheat, where you have large equipment. It's much better in orchards and in intense vegetable and production areas.
Okay, good. All right, William?
Hi, Bill Weston, American Meat Institute. I think just a couple of observations which may turn into questions, but in terms of grain production, we've seen in the north, if you're driving along the highway in July and August and looking at the corn crop, it looks a lot like the corn crop in Iowa and Nebraska. But when you fly over it and look down, you see all of these little squares of corn, and the rows are all going in different directions because they're all owned by a separate farmer. So I think in China's interest in increasing productivity of grains, they're going to have to address this social problem. They mechanize those lands, and it's all over. You see it near Tianjin, you see it up up near Chongqing and so forth. What are we going to do with these farmers? And I think it's the same issue in pork production. And if you relate those two, China has one of the highest conversion ratios for grain in the world because of the amount of restaurant residues and food residues that goes into the swine industry. So if they move to these large consolidated sow operations, where's the grain going to come from? Is one question. I think the other issue is in the last few, we've been in the China Meat Association in the last 4 years, Chinese officials have acknowledged the need to move away from the wet market system and these, what they have in terms of livestock production, more from an animal health perspective and a food safety perspective than anything else. So if you do that, where's the cold chain established and who's going to do it when you move to case-ready product? And I think that's the challenge they're going to face. And I think they're interested in doing this, and we're interested in helping them.
I just want to give Bill a shout out here. I first met Bill when he was the Minister Counselor for Agriculture Affairs at our embassy in Beijing. He's a real China expert in these issues. And so really, no, you are, Bill. You bring a lot to this, and of course had served in Brazil as well. But, to your questions, that's exactly, that's a great one. Where are they going to get more grain for increasing? It's not just about the soybeans, of course, it's that they need more grain. Or are they going to be importing their pigs from somewhere else? Are they going to be bringing in pigs? I just don't think that's going to meet we're not going to get to the peak just from importing pigs from elsewhere or pork from elsewhere, because China has so far to go unless they change behavior, right? Unless, as they're becoming a wealthier nation, they already have a middle class larger than the U.S. population, they say we're not going to eat as much meat. But it's a fascinating question.
Let me just pick up on one of the points you were asking about small holdings. And one of the problems with small holdings is that soil testing becomes very complicated. In this country, we test soils, and even during the growing season, we'll take plant tissues and check them for nutrient content to make sure they're getting exactly what they need in order to maximize yield. But when you have these small plots, you have to test them individually because they're managed differently and so forth.
Right.
Maybe millions of them. And so it's a lot of soil testing, a lot of lab work because you have these as you noticed looking down from the plane, all these small holdings. The other thing that I think we have to be concerned with in looking at the future and the overall supply is the glass ceiling that exists on yields. I mean, there are a number of countries now where not only are yields not increasing, but they're not even trying to increase them because they realize that they've hit this glass ceiling. Wheat yields in France have not increased now for a dozen years. They were going up and then they flattened. Same has happened with wheat in the UK and Germany. It's happening with rice in Japan and South Korea, and it's going to happen with rice in China because China's rice yields now are only about 4% below those of Japan. And unless they can go above Japan's, which I very much doubt, then China has this glass ceiling too. And with a number of countries around the world hitting glass ceilings, that is limits on how much they can produce, it's going to be more and more difficult to expand production enough to keep up with the demand generated by both population growth and rising affluence. When you get probably 3 billion people in the world moving up the food chain, that does generate additional demand for grain. So this year happens to be a very good crop year for the world. And so we have low corn prices, lowest in some time, but every year is not going to be a good year for the world. We're going to have climate problems, we're going to have heat stress, we're going to have drought, and we still have this problem hanging over our heads of aquifer depletion and wells going dry. Wells do go dry when the aquifers are depleted. So we've got some substantial challenges coming up, and one of the problems that we have with USDA projections and FAO projections is that they are not made by agronomists. They are made by economists. I hope there are no economists in the room, but
In DC, of course, there's someone in the room as an economist.
what happens when they do projections at USDA and they want to project for the next 10 years, they just take the last 10 or 20 years and extrapolate it into the future. And that's worked pretty well up until now. But it's not going to work indefinitely in the future. And so we're counting some chickens. I think there probably is some eggs that aren't going to hatch out there. And I don't think we're really, as a society, prepared for that, because we look at USDA projections, FAO projections, no problem. But I think there are going to be problems. And the other thing is, I'm impressed with how little the agricultural economists who are doing the projections know about the water situation. It's not. I mean, they just look at the past and extrapolate into the future. So that's a problem of analysis. And if we don't have the analysis, then we certainly can't develop the policies responding to the issues that are raised with the analysis.
Lester, here's a question that we haven't quite touched on here today. What about the issue, because I was reading some things about in China's, with the corn boom that happened, that there's also concern in the Chinese government that because they have so much corn that maybe they can't store it and some of it will go bad. What about the issue of waste of grain in China, and maybe just even more broadly, food waste in China? Because I mean, I know that, I mean, in the US, I mean, there's a lot of food waste, but you're wasting water too. Do we know what's going on with that in China?
Well, it used to be that China was kind of a model for minimizing waste in the food sector, because at the village level, every family had a pig, and that pig was the disposal. And so any food scraps, or when you're preparing food, part of the cabbage you don't eat and so forth, the pigs got that, and then they ate the pigs. That was a very good system, but that system is breaking down now as village life, traditional village life. I remember Mao used to refer to pigs as four-legged fertilizer factories, and that was true. You had the manure to go back on the land because the production and consumption was in the same area. We've now broken that link, not only in China but worldwide, and most of us, 80% of us, live in cities. And so we concentrate nutrients in cities, and that creates a problem of how you dispose of it without ruining local water systems or what have you. And it's the same problem with feedlots. Concentrating a lot of pigs or steers in a feedlot, you get a lot of concentrated waste, and you have to figure out how to, it really needs to be redistributed. And in the old days, when we had general farms, the manure got redistributed by the farmer with a manure spreader. But now, the people who grow the corn and the people who grow the pigs may be thousands of miles apart. So we've got a very different economy with the nutrient cycle seriously disrupted. And not only do we lose the nutrients and they create problems, but we also we're losing the nutrients and creating problems, but also using energy in the process of producing those nutrients. So it's not an ideal situation, but the economy, it still makes sense economically, and as long as it does, we probably won't really try to tighten that or restore the nutrient cycle that we once had.
And in fact, China is pushing an urbanization drive, and so they absolutely won't be restoring that. And Bill, those individual grain plots, they'll be consolidated soon too, because China wants fewer people working the land. They want more citizens in cities where they're going to consume and drive the economy that way.
Okay, wow. Let's see, I gotta be fair. We'll go to the back because we've neglected them, and then we come to you. Because you were here first today, so I really gotta let you ask a question. The microphone to the woman in the back row there. Sorry, Xiaopei. She's got it. And why don't you hand it to him across there, so we'll gather two together.
Hi, Winnie Lau from the Pew Charitable Trust.
Hi, Winnie.
Hi. My question is about seafood. The figures I've seen is that seafood consumption and demand are going up. So is seafood factoring into the food security issue at all? And is it a priority for the Chinese government?
Great question. And then this from you. Do you have a mic? You can ask your question too.
My question concerns.
Oh, and who are you? So sorry.
Oh, Charlie Martin.
Charlie Martin, they
Yeah.
didn't know.
Yeah,
Okay.
my question is about water waste because there's a tremendous amount of it. And the argument's often made that China has to price its water to market. What do you think of that?
I think it's a great idea, not only for China, but for the world. And we have inherited kind of almost a free water mentality with irrigation. I remember, a half century ago when we started investing in water facilities in California, canals and so forth, and created brand new production areas producing mostly vegetables. But it was being subsidized by taxpayers, and vegetable growers in the east, southern New Jersey, where I grew up, were being squeezed because they could grow them at, great land and solar intensity in California. And then you combine that with subsidized water, you've got some real competition for farmers in South Jersey, for example, where I grew up. So that's an issue. On the seafood question, China has responded to that. I think the latest numbers I saw, and Janet or Matt Roney, who are here, can correct me on this, but China's producing farmed fish to the extent of about 40 million tons a year. And then the oceanic catch adds another 15, 17 million tons to that. But fish farming is really big in China, and again, Janet, Matt, you may have to help me out with this, but I think at least half, maybe 60% of all the fish farming in the world is in China. It has really found a place in the Chinese food economy. Janet?
I got Matt's got the mic first, so maybe
Okay.
he's going to take over. And hey, Matt.
Yeah, the numbers that we ran yesterday from the Food and Agriculture Organization, it's about 60% of farmed fish in the world are produced in China. A lot of that's kept at home. A lot of it's carp. And we also found a statistic in a paper, partly written by Roz Naylor of Stanford, said that in the 90s, something like 5% of fish meal, which is used in fish farming operations as feed, about 5% was imported into China, 5% of world fish meal production, about 45% was imported in China in 2009. So you can see how that's ramped up.
And some of that has that soy in it, right?
Right.
Yes, we got soy. We should just title this meeting, It's All About Soybeans. Okay. Any other stats from you guys you want to? We're getting to you. You're next up. Did you have anything to say about the fishy question?
No, nothing to add on that. I mean, just that I don't think that the Chinese government is trying to direct people to consume more fish rather than another kind of protein right now. But I spent 3 years living in southern Jiangsu province and saw a lot of fish farming, and it's only really taken off since then. And so it's certainly part of the Chinese diet, but moving it away from the focus on pork is going to be a challenge, which again, I point to you because I think it's only going to happen when the Chinese government says it's part of something else for China, which is a more sustainable future.
Yeah, and okay, I'll take a question in the back. I got a gentleman back there. Lester will probably be right back, but we'll save him the question if it's for him. Yeah. And just quick question, we're running out of time here, so we want to gather up more questions. Yeah.
Okay, Kevin Tian from Science and Technology Daily, a Chinese newspaper.
Okay.
I would say thanks to Mr. Brown is here. He's not here.
He'll be right back.
He'll be back.
He'll be back.
His significant book is really educating a lot of Chinese people. So, okay, he just mentioned about soybean production in China is almost keep the same level for 20 years, but consumption is growing faster. I think the main reason is the transgene soybean production imported is very fast in China. So the question to follow is that how do you think about transgene soybean?
The GMOs?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
okay.
GMO,
So
yes.
GMOs, okay.
It's really healthy to to human being. And the second is if China cut down the importation of transgenic soybean, what that means to what market and U.S. farmers? Yes, thank you.
Lester, it's still all about soybeans in here today. You walked out. You're back. That. Thanked you about your book yet again. The question about GMOs, about whether GMO soybeans are, just I guess GMOs in general are healthy for people. And correct me if I'm wrong, so if China cut down on GMOs, how might that impact global food trade? I think you dabbled in that trade issue at some point too. So.
The interesting thing about genetic modification is that despite the enormous investment that's been made in this area, there's not been a single case of increased yield attributable to genetic modification. It all has to do with insecticides and herbicides and tolerance and so forth. And the unfortunate reality is that this is an issue that should have been researched substantially. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, when it saw this coming years ago, should have launched a research program. They never did. And so today we rely on research by the companies that are manufacturing the products. There's just not much else out there. And that's a case where our system has actually failed us in a real way. We just don't know what the effects of genetic modification are on diets and human health, and it's a huge gap, unfortunately.
Okay. Anything?
No, on the trade issue, I think Lester actually already addressed it. If there weren't such a great demand for soybeans, coming from China, I think people would be growing some different products, some different crops in the United States. Do you think that some of the soybeans would go elsewhere, Lester? That was the other part of the question.
If they didn't go to China?
If they didn't go to China.
Well, if they didn't go to China, then China would have to import part of its meat that it now grows domestically. So that would, it's kind of hard to make an assumption that excludes China from this. China's not the only country that uses soybean meal. The Europeans use quite a bit of soybean meal now. Traditionally, they had used other meals, but soybean meal just is a very high quality supplement with grain, whether you're feeding pigs or steers or chickens. And so the use of soybean meal in feed has been going up. I mean, it's a hefty growth trend, and I think it's going to continue to, as we do still have 3 billion people in the world wanting to move up the food chain, and that means more soybeans, not for them to consume directly, but to mix with the grain to feed all the pigs and cattle and chicken and so forth. So soybeans have found a place, and the more affluent people there are in the world, the more important the role of soybeans will become. So when we look at this 3 billion people in the world moving up the, what I call the grain ladder, up the food chain, the demand for soybeans is going to move up with them.
Okay. Okay, the back of the room in the darkest corner, you should never sit there because I totally can't see with the lights. But I think I see a hand in the very far back corner, and then we'll come back to the front here.
You see two hands, actually.
Oh, you were like waving them too? Okay.
Quite.
Okay, well, stand on up and tell us who you are. And quick question. I'm going to gather a couple questions, and then
My
we'll.
name's Peyton Wise. I'm just a civilian. Were the results of that Chinese soil survey ever released? It was a state secret while they were doing it. That's what I understood. And what percentage of the food safety problem is strictly just contaminated environment? Environmental contaminant. I mean, it's not something you can tell people to change their attitudes about or whatever. I mean, it's if they've polluted the place, they got to find a way to filter it out. So,
Okay.
did they ever release this survey? Is my question.
I don't know that.
There's parts of the survey, correct me if someone correct me if I'm wrong, but some of the information from the survey was released. I think I mean, part of the problem is because, as Amy has, kind of implied that, I mean, the Ministry of Environmental Protection, they don't really have rules yet on how to deal with soil contamination. And so the fear of releasing it when the government would be standing there like, here's how bad it is, we don't know what to do. So, but again, we are seeing, the fact that there is talk about a soil, did you hear about, there's going to be a soil action plan?
I didn't.
Who knew that there is a soil action plan kind of percolating up somewhere. But that it is a big issue, and yeah, so no, it's not a lot of info from that survey, but studies from Chinese researchers have come out. That's where we found out about the Hunan rice, and the Chinese saying that 20% of China's soil is probably contaminated with heavy metals. So, Steve, did you have some? Okay, just check it.
Yeah, one of the interesting questions this raises, Jennifer, if 20% of the soil is has a high heavy metal content, it probably should be taken out of production. But
And you see consumers in China buying foreign products for that reason. It's not just about, to answer your question, it's not just about processing of products where there's a problem with food safety and oversight. It's also the sourcing of the products. But obviously, the people who can afford to buy imported products are the very top of this middle class that we're talking about. And so for most of China's citizens, they have to deal with that high content. And so the question for the government is, what do we do? Do we increase imports or do we clean up our soil? And it sounds like that's what they're saying they have to do. They don't have the luxury.
the other thing is, how much does it cost to clean up soil that's saturated with heavy metals?
It's not, our World Bank soil chemical person was telling us, it's a lot.
And how much time will it take, right? I mean, all of these questions, and again, back to the enormity of so many of the issues that the government is facing every day.
But the fact is that, a few years back, when we were doing our food safety stuff, I wasn't finding anyone that was trying to do a soil project in China. So I'm looking for a little bit of good news here. There was evidently in the dark corners, there was another person.
Yeah, me.
And who are you?
I'm Ken Meyercourt,
Okay.
World Ducks. We feed almost half our corn crop to our cars, which relates to the archetype and most critical case of a commodity peak oil. What are the chances that we will dedicate more of that corn crop to feeding China, and the world for that matter, versus our need for liquid fuel?
Yeah, I think it's 32% of the corn crop that now is used for ethanol production. Not all of that 32% is lost in feeding, because once you get the oil, once you get the ethanol, you have the residue that can be fed to cattle. I remember growing up on the farm in southern New Jersey, and we used to get brewer's grain delivered from the Philadelphia brewers to our farm, which was about 40 miles away. And I remember the trucks, high sides, like dump trucks loaded with brewer's grain, and the water dripping out, and they smelled like, it smelled like brewer's grain. But mixing it with some high energy things like corn, what you got basically from the brewers was the fiber part of the grain that didn't break down and convert into alcohol. So mixing that with some ground corn, some cornmeal, actually turned out to be a rather inexpensive ration for our herd of dairy cows, for example. But on the broader question, my guess is that the corn/ethanol industry is not going to last forever, and how fast it will be phased out, I don't know. It has not grown in the last few years, and it's actually, I think, gone down just 2 or 3 or 4%. But it's not in my mind a sensible thing to do, and as grain prices rise over time, as I expect they will, I doubt that it'll be economic over the long term to convert grain into fuel for cars. The other thing is that the automobile system is changing too, and there is a very rapid movement toward all-electric cars that will be powered, hopefully not by coal-powered plants, but by wind farms and solar energy. If we get solar panels on our roofs, we can recharge our car batteries, in the driveway. So that's part of a new energy economy that's beginning to take shape. I call it in the book I'm working on now, the great transition, the shift from fossil fuels to solar and wind energy. But it's going to come much faster than we think. And I think in that shift, that using corn for ethanol will probably fade by the wayside.
Okay, I actually think, do you two have like so microscopic, like little questions that could be answered quickly? Okay, just real quick. Hugh and this gentleman here. Super quick questions. No long statements.
All right, this one's going to be real quick. My name is Lauren Pewitt from ChinaAg.org. Essentially, everybody agrees that China's pork industry needs to be more efficient and productive, and the U.S. has some of the most productive swine in our country, whereas the southern Chinese species are not as productive when you look at like lean meat per pound. Now, is there a concern that maybe the U.S. will export live pork breeds over to China and they will overtake Chinese breeds, or is that not a concern at all?
Okay, it's one big question.
Right.
Yours has to be soybean, or we're not
Thank you,
going to let you
Mr.
ask.
Braun. I have a question for Mr. Braun. You wrote a very famous book, Who Will Feed China, years ago. I'm old enough to read that book. Do you have the answer today now? Thank you.
The question is still on the table.
All right, that was.
No, I think when we're talking about soybeans, we were getting part of that answer. Those soybeans are going to come from the U.S., Brazil, and Argentina. And that, if you were to convert China's import of soybeans into grain equivalent, it would be China importing 140 million tons of grain out of a total consumption of about 500 million tons. The other interesting question is the conversion efficiency. We have seen, I think I may have mentioned earlier, that beef in the feedlot takes 7 pounds of grain per pound of live weight. Pigs, it's about 3 pounds per. Poultry gets down to well below 2 and down towards almost a 1-for-1. And we are seeing a shift in the U.S. consumption pattern in this direction. I mean, when I can remember 1950, chicken was something you had for Sunday dinner. It was a very special thing. Now chicken is what you have when you can't think of anything else because it's so inexpensive and so readily available. So in this country, we have seen, it used to be beef was the principal meat, then pork overtook beef, but poultry has overtaken everything, and it has really moved to the top. And so we have moved to the more efficient, to the most efficient converters of grain into animal protein. The one exception to this is that if cattle are produced on the range and never make it to the feedlot, grass-fed cattle, which you can usually buy grass-fed beef now, then there's no grain use at all. The problem there is the constraint on grazing area. We just do not have the grazing area to eat much more grass-fed beef than we now do in the world. The other interesting thing in thinking of U.S. and China in contrast is that the U.S. and China have about the same number of cattle, roughly 100 million head in both countries. The U.S. has 9 million sheep and goats. China has 282 million sheep and goats. And those sheep and goats are literally devegetating the countryside and creating a serious soil erosion problem. There is now in Western China a huge dust bowl that's developed, probably larger than anything in the world. It dwarfs the dust bowl we had in this country in the 1930s. And so when we look at food and environment, we're seeing some enormous stresses building with no way of dealing with them. I do not think that the Chinese government has the political standing and clout to go to the villagers and say you have to reduce the size of your herds by 40% or whatever it's going to take to get them down to a sustainable level. I think they're just going to keep going until the ecosystem collapses as it is, and then they'll end up in the cities where the government wants them anyhow.
And I would add to that, Lester, we do know from the Chinese government that they don't want to invest, for example, in a beef industry in China. They would rather bring that in through imported product, and I'm sure it's because of resource constraints. And on your question about pigs, I'm going to refer you to an expert sitting in the back of the room after this meeting, and Mike Scahill is here from Smithfield. I'll ask him to answer that question.
Wave your hand so he can find you. It's pig matchmaking here today. All right, so a couple things to say. First of all, today showed me what no PowerPoints can do. We had a very different kind of it's liberating. Woohoo! Well, next time I have a meeting, no PowerPoints. But it's also that, so we did a tour today, food safety, food security in China, and we went from macro, what's happening in the world agricultural system, moving things around, getting down to soybean, soil, and pigs. So we covered a lot of ground today. The China Environment Forum, we're rebooting our whole food safety, food security work here, going to be doing a series of meetings. Someone mentioned Roz Naylor from Stanford. We're pulling her and her mafia on food security come in the probably January or so. So we are going to be doing more meetings on this because I'm seeing there's interest, right? When we have to do auditorium sometimes when we talk about coal, because coal's so sexy, but maybe this isn't the sexiest topic. I think it's sexy. You've confirmed I did my dissertation on the right topic. I focused on water. But it's also that this is a vitally important topic. There clearly is a lot of smart people in DC. We want to be encouraging more people in the network to work on this. So first of all, more applause for these two great PowerPoint-free people. And noting that tomorrow, my Latin America program colleagues, they asked me to co-sponsor a meeting that's about Chinese investment in Latin America. Part of the issue is agriculture. We got some Chinese journalists, so you guys need to come and report on your colleagues, talking with some Latin America experts. So come to that. I want to thank, I forgot to thank at the beginning, the Kissinger Institute. They sent this email out to their network. Some of you are new to me. Sign up for my mailing list too. We do fun stuff. And I have to thank Blue Moon Fund, Luce Foundation, Climate Works, and Hewlett Foundation because they seem to like me and they support my work. So thank you very much and hope to see you soon. All right.